So that being said, welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking about some automation tools specifically for use with Creo. We are Elite and we are happy to present today, but we're actually going to be joined by expert in the field. I'll introduce in just a moment. Let me just tell you a little bit about Elite. We are a manufacturing company as well as an engineering services company. You can see we've got a couple different divisions. So in our factory, we are using various tools, software tools to do our engineering and our manufacturing. And our engineering services group is a partner with PTC, which has various products that you can see below. Today, we'll be talking about Creo and some of the automation tools for that. And for that, we are partnered with a company called Simplified Logic. And Dave Bigelow is going to be joining us today, giving the presentation. You can see some of their tools listed below: Nitro Bomb, Nitro Cell, and Nitro Program. We've given some presentations on these in the past. We will, I'm sure, show them again since they're very powerful and we love making these tools available to people. So very quick intro. I'll let Dave introduce himself a little bit more. And just quickly for reference, our contact information. So myself, Stuart Weiler, the Director of PLM at Elite, and for David Bigelow at Simplified Logic. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help you, and hopefully you find today's session interesting. So Dave, whenever you are ready.
Okay, let's see here, just make sure we've got everything rocking and rolling. See the screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about an interesting subject. Number one, it's just dealing with Excel and Creo for sure, but in order to kind of really understand the power of that combination, I was talking with Stuart, and we just wanted to kind of get a good basic introduction to Excel tables and Power Query. These are some areas of Excel that people may have heard about but not used before. So I thought we'd do a quick training session on how to use those and how to set them up, just to kind of get your head around how Excel works a little bit. Then we'll show at the end dealing with bills of materials in Creo, and how one of our products, NitroBomb, can take advantage of all this cool technology we're going to be talking about here and really streamline the process and make it easy to do. So the first thing I want to start off by saying is that there's a huge disclaimer with this. There are many ways to use Excel, and you may know some better tips, tricks, or approaches to doing things. We're just going to cover some of the basic concepts and examples today, and hopefully you learned something or kind of pick up on something you didn't know. I do realize there's many ways to do things, and I think this is just going to kind of cover the basics of how to get there. So one of the key things about Excel that we fundamentally have to realize is that there are a lot of features and benefits, and they typically start off with just cell data, like how do you enter information into Excel. And this is what most people just kind of use Excel for. I'm creating a spreadsheet, I'm going to put some data into it, and then they typically will use formulas to kind of reference cell data to do things with it, like for example to add numbers or concatenate data or summarize information in some way. Another area of Excel that is getting more use over time is something called the name range, which is basically just a simplified reference to Excel data, like cell data. Cell addresses are now basically described as names to or variables to that information, which is helpful. Some newer areas that Excel's come out with over the last 10 years or so is something called the table. A table is basically just it's like a named range on steroids. I view it as kind of like going from a portable phone, which is kind of like a named range, to kind of like the first iPhone. It has all these capabilities, but it's very modular and it keeps things very well structured. But it still kind of does the basic stuff, takes advantage of the basic information that's already there. Then when you really scale up to the real benefits of Excel, especially these days, this has been something that's been around since 2010 with Excel 2010, is something called a query. Now, it originally started as a kind of an add-on to Excel, but since I think 2016 of Excel, it's become kind of baked in, and it's been around for quite a while. It's very powerful capability. But unfortunately, it's a bit buried in Excel, and not many people know it exists or even how to use it. So most Excel users still to this day live in this kind of cell data and formula world. A few of them will go into the named ranges uh, zone of Excel or kind of use that capability. But less than 1% of Excel users still to this day tap into tables and queries. And this is a pretty big problem because it really does reduce the workloads and efforts required to kind of get some amazing results out of Excel in a very short period of time. So when you're talking about like the Excel data, the typical Excel user using Excel data and formulas to kind of get around and do things, the problem is that most of that effort is very manual, very detailed, often very cryptic because they may not set up named ranges and they're just doing cell references. And the bigger the worksheet gets, or the workbook gets, with more worksheets and so on and so forth, it just becomes very cryptic and hard to kind of navigate. Where's information coming from? Why is it there? Why is it being used in this formula or that formula? And as a result, it tends to be pretty delicate, especially the larger a project gets. And the more cryptic and delicate it becomes, the harder it is to share that document with others to be able to take advantage of the efforts you put into kind of putting Excel together. On the other hand, a query is kind of like the latest iPhone or latest Samsung phone or whatever. It pretty much opens everything with your face. It's that easy of an experience compared to kind of the old way of doing things. So to kind of give you, I was thinking about this and I was like, okay, well, what's the core issue of Excel, and how do we have to kind of always remember to think about things? Well, there's really kind of four quadrants to this process. And if you really think about it, typically Excel is a data forward process fundamentally, meaning we're taking cell values, we're writing a formula, and we're translating them into other information, or we're putting them in other cells for other purposes or uses. Named ranges are kind of just to make that a little bit easier, less cryptic to kind of look at, and you can still use the same formulas and process to kind of get to those same results. Tables are kind of the next layer above that, or the next level above that in information handling. And you can still use formulas within tables or use formulas external to a table to kind of refer to it to produce outputs. And tables can also feed other tables too. So they are very powerful. And when you start doing things with tables, the formulation of things and the reference of things gets a lot easier versus using cell values and formulas and even named ranges. And I'll show a couple examples of how to do this. The other nice thing about Excel in this data forward process, and this is something that's very important to remember, is that in Excel, whenever you're using Excel, you're not really ever modifying the source data. It's always I put data in, and then I'm trying to transform it or use it in another way or refer to it to get to some other result. So what Power Query does is it's kind of this data transformation process. It's this upper level of this four quadrants here. And how it works is basically you establish a connection to the information that you want to reference, and it's typically expects a table. So you can use cell values, but it's really hard to incorporate cell values and named ranges into Power Query. It's much easier to use tables as a reference, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. It's just easier to do with tables, and that's kind of where they gravitate towards with the product. So a connection basically establishes just a reference to that data, and then you build your query around that. And in that query, you can actually start to merge data, append data, transform it, or apply formulas to it above and beyond, the levels of what a user would normally see. And then the output of that is a table. That's what it expects to drop to. So a query and a Power Query process is kind of it's still in Excel, but it's kind of um, not as obvious that it's occurring, but the results will be obvious because they always come back to a table. Now, the other neat thing about queries is that you can not just use connections or create connections to tables within the Excel document, but you can also create connections to other data sources. So for example, if you needed to connect to an ERP system or an MRP system or bring in a text file or a CSV file or some other data source like that. You could do that quite easily, or even data from other workbooks. You can create connections to other sources quite easily, bring those in and augment them and manipulate them with the data that you're manually entering or copying, pasting, or deriving in some way within your Excel workbook to produce the final results you're looking for. The cool part about this with the Power Query stuff is that queries can actually reference other queries, either as duplicates or copies or other connections. So you can actually recycle information. So instead of loading data more than once, you could actually load it once and then make a copy of that internally within the Power Query realm and reference it so that if any data changes, you can actually, let's say you wanted to summarize data in one way in one particular query, but organize data or modify it in another query, you can still use the same source data to do that. So it's very, very, very powerful capability. But again, it's not very obvious, and we're going to try to expose some of that and make it more transparent today. The overall benefit, of these features is pretty profound. So once you start kind of getting into tables and you start getting into queries, your life literally changes. You just don't ever think of Excel the same way again, especially when you're dealing with large amounts of data or even simple data that just comes like simple stuff that comes out of Creo and you want to manipulate it or summarize it or organize it in some way. You're going to start gravitating toward tables all the time for simple things as well as the complex. There's a special mention here within Excel. They do have this capability called arrays. Arrays have been around a long time. If you've ever seen them or had to use them, they're really, really tricky. They're really kind of a mental exercise as to what's going on and how you apply them, when to apply them, how to create them, and how formulas use them. It's kind of an expert-only thing, and I don't even think they're needed, especially with Power Queries. So if you're comfortable with arrays, I suggest get uncomfortable with them. They're just not worth it in the long run. And most people who receive a workbook that has those in there, it's too easy to modify a formula or something and screw it up royally. So arrays are special in Excel, and our general direction and recommendation is to avoid them if you can, because Power Query and tables just kind of make things so much easier. So as an example, we're kind of going to walk through today. This is just pure Excel stuff right now. I'm not even going to talk about Creo at this point. We're going to talk about Creo later and how we make it much easier using this technology with our tools. But let's just kind of focus on the basics of how do I do things in Excel. And this particular example that we're looking at here is, we're going to come back to this, but in a typical BOM cost estimation, doesn't matter if it's Creo or whether it's just Excel data or CSV data that you're working with and trying to summarize in some way from an ERP system or whatever. You typically have a data goes to a table. Then we're going to, we can use that table for getting some summary metrics if we want to, or you can do other things like merge it with other data sources to kind of transform that into the final results. For example, summarizing the cost or component counts or whatever the case may be. So that previous slide that I showed had a lot of different paths to kind of get there. When it comes down to BOM cost estimation, this is really kind of the key components that we're going to be looking at. So just as a quick refresher, named ranges in Excel are pretty simple to do. And I want to kind of use this as a baseline just to kind of show you the difference between how to do things with named ranges versus how they're done with tables and then ultimately queries. So when you look at creating named ranges, if you haven't done it before, this is basically how it's done. It's actually a formula operation, and there's a name manager, and you can also define names manually. So if you just entered text into a particular cell or range and selected it, you could actually go up and say define a name to that reference, and you'll notice here in the dialog below that it's referring to a specific sheet and address, and you're giving it a kind of a generic name or a variable for what that's going to be. You could also do that directly within Excel up in the upper left-hand corner of the worksheet. You could just manually type in the name to that. It's the same way to get there. And if you ever select on a cell and it has a named range, it'll display there. So the weird thing about named ranges is that you can actually have multiple named ranges to the same reference, which is kind of a cool thing, but there are some limitations to them, which we'll talk about in a second. Another way to do it is to just go directly into the name manager. So you basically select a cell, or you say that's the target cell I'm interested in, go to the name manager, and then you could go define a brand new name and then select the actual location that it refers to. That's another way, just another path to get there. Once you have them created, the big benefit is that you have something that can be globally referenced throughout the workbook. So if I have a named range called my intro that I've created, and if I go to another sheet and I start to write a formula, so you start off with an equals, and you start to type in the name of that variable, it'll show up automatically in the dropdown. And then you could just kind of select that and then have the value kind of result. Now that result that is there is actually a formula to that particular named range variable. So you can see there all the way on the right that we have hello world basically being referenced to the named range that is pointing to the original source data. And if we change the data on sheet one, it'll just automatically update no matter where that variable is used throughout the entire workbook, whether it be in a formula or whether it be a specific value reference like we're doing here. The biggest benefits and problems for named ranges is basically this. They are the benefits are their workbook global references, which is fantastic, right? Because you can go anywhere in the workbook, you can just recall that information, reference it, and continue to use it within formulas or just as a value reference that you want to place in an Excel cell, and that's fantastic. The cool thing about them also is that you can rename them, you can move them around manually. If you drag a cell and move it, it'll move that reference with it. They can be redefined with these if you want to change the name or the region that it occupies. It's pretty easy to do that. The problems with them is that they're not case sensitive, and what I mean by that is that as you see there, our variable is my intro, my capital I intro. If you try to create another my intro that starts with capital M and has all lowercase values or all capitals, Excel won't care. It's basically just going to take that named range as it's going to assume it's the same thing and revert to the very first version of that, I believe. And they are also typically static. Now, static is a debatable thing because if you have a value that is changing by a formula or is updating, the content is dynamic at that point to the named range, but the named range is fundamentally a static reference. You can make them dynamic. There are some arguments for that by using combinations of other features of Excel. For example, tables are good at that, but fundamentally they're just kind of a static reference for the most part. As you can see here in this graphic, the difference between using the typical sheet cell reference, address reference for writing formulas, it looks really cryptic and delicate versus using a named range, which is just a much better way to kind of refer to information that you're going to be using or computing. So I'm going to show you real quick a painful example of how. Let me share a different screen. Okay, so I assume you can see the Excel sheet that we have here, and you'll notice that I have three sets of examples I'm going to show. So this particular example is a bill of materials that we're trying to summarize for the unique components and also the unique items within it and get some metadata about that. Okay, so we've got some data that's been added here. And unfortunately, we had to add in some kind of helper columns to kind of detect what's going on. If we do the show formulas on this, you'll notice that our data this is our core data right here, but we have all this extra stuff kind of going around that's pointing to each of these named ranges that are set up. So you can see here that this particular cell is referring to end body. Well, end body is this kind of blue part. This one is also referring to kind of the counts of those items, unique counts of those items. And this one is referring to trying to determine whether or not the item, we're trying to get a unique list of items. So this is basically to compare a self comparison to that data, and the formulas are kind of nasty. So and they're kind of all over the place. If I were to receive this from somebody I worked with, I'd probably scream, just because it's complicated. And yeah, there's a pattern to it, but I still have to go through and evaluate every change that I'm going to make to this to try to understand what the impact is. To give you an idea of kind of how much of a mess this is, I'm going to trace the dependence on, some of these cell values. So every one of these cell values, as you see, is actually kind of pointing to different areas of the sheets. And it's easy to kind of see, yeah, I can kind of trace what the flow of the information is, but it is still a lot to look at. So if I highlight any of these things, you can see I've just got relationships going all over the place. And this is one of the real pains of dealing with named ranges, is that are very beneficial in trying to define the references for things, but they do not, but they are also delicate. So if I come in and I say I've got a test new item here, notice my item counts and quantities, which are 40 in this case, are just kind of staying there the same no matter what I add in. It's not, I have to go and update this range to include those items, or I have to go insert data within here. So if I come in and insert data within here, say test, whoops, test item here, should get 41, test item. I think it's probably pinging off a lot of things. And we got to copy the formula down. Yeah. So you see, I've got to go make a lot of like changes just to make sure things are kind of correct in the end. So they're very kind of structured and static, with the exception of I've got to go, unless I know what I'm doing, to go insert information or modify it so that all the rest of my formulas work. So they tend to be a little bit painful. Point here. So let me switch back over to screen here. So let's talk about tables. So tables in Excel are actually pretty cool. So they're also very easy to set up. So if you actually have just a cells entered in a worksheet like we've shown here, all you have to do is just kind of highlight the region that you're interested in, go up to the insert function and hit table, and then it's going to say, okay, you want to create a table? Great. Now, it's strongly recommended that you always put titles or a header on each of these columns that you're working with, because it's just going to be much easier to deal with down the road, because tables will infer a column name if you don't give it one. And when you're defining a table, you can optionally say, I don't want table headers, but then it'll just assume some headers for you and kind of infer new column names on the fly anyway. So it's just better to create them with headers to get it over with. So when you do that, that's going to create a new reference. Let me switch over here. Another way to do this is to just select the same data, and then if you're on a more current version of Excel, you've got a quick format kind of icon that shows up in the lower left corner. If you just select tables and say select table, it will actually create a table from that data also. But once you've done this probably 2 or 3 times, you get frustrated with the menu picks and you start using the shortcut. And the shortcut is Control T. So basically you just highlight the data, hit Control T, and it's going to come up with that same exact create table dialog that you would see via any other method. And when you say, okay, create it, it's going to enable a new interface for you called Table Tools. And it's going to kind of default show you this. And you'll also notice that the format of the information that you had highlighted will change. So it's actually going to switch from kind of the plain Jane view that you had it to kind of their default table style for presenting that same information. The dead giveaway that it's a table right off the bat is typically the filter buttons show up at the top of those columns, and this interface pops up when you or becomes available when you click in it. And another very, very important thing is that, and I wish Microsoft would do this, when you create a table, I wish it would give you the ability to just give it the name right off the bat, but they don't. So they kind of assume that the name of the table, which is basically a glorified named range in Excel, is going to default to kind of a table and then some numeric index that it keeps adding. So the first thing you should always do when you're dealing with tables is to change the name of the thing so that it is at least something you can understand and reference later. So if you had, for example, a bill of materials and you also had cost data in separate tables that you created on different sheets, it would, knowing which one was table 1 versus table 7 that it happened to create is kind of a pain. So always name your your tables after you create them, and you could do it at any time. You can even change the name at any time, but it's very important to just make sure you get the named range, or excuse me, the table name set up so that it's addressable by Excel. Now, when you do that, like for example, we called this table that is being displayed bomb data. That's the name of the table we gave it. Uh, you can use it like you would a named range at that point. However, there are some additional benefits. So if you type in equals bomb data and then hard bracket, bomb data will show up in kind of a little pick list of functions. And then when you hit the hard bracket, it'll expose this other set of references about that table that you can use. This is called the structured reference. Structured references are very, very powerful in Excel. They really make things easy to understand and use, and you could do things with them like this. So if I wanted to, let's say, get the count of the items that were in that column manually using an Excel formula, you could just say, I'm going to use my standard Excel formula for count A, and then I'm going to put bomb data and then hard bracket and component. Now that component is actually the column name of the table that is there. And it could be whatever the column name is that you want. And the beauty about tables is that once you set up these structured references, you can actually change the column orders in the table. So if I want a description to be first, component to be second, the formulas won't break. So it's smart enough to know even if the data shifts or gets reorganized in a columnar way, it'll still maintain those references. So that structured reference formula that you see there actually will, in this particular case, produce a result of 15. So the other beauty about Excel tables is that they will, by default, auto expand on the rows and columns to the right. Now, if this doesn't work for you when you're experimenting with Excel, that's a dead giveaway that the option is not enabled or has been accidentally turned off. And it is very easy to turn off through the Excel context menus if you're not careful. So if it's not auto expanding when you add content just below the table, then it's an option setting within Excel. It just needs to be changed. But in this particular case, I want to point out two things. Number one, we're adding some new content to the bottom, and the end of the table always has kind of this little caret in the lower right corner, and that's actually a drag handle. So if it doesn't auto expand, you can actually just drag that little handle and drag it down or up to take care of things. And you can also right click in the table and do operations like delete rows or insert rows, things like that also. So if we added a bunch of content, the nice thing about this is that the table will automatically expand to the end of your content, and then your formulas, your structured references, like you saw up there, just like magic, will just kind of encapsulate that change. So in that particular case, the item count is looking at the component column of this table, and it just updates automatically. Another kind of nifty thing you could do is, let's say we wanted to add a new column to the right. Well, you could just literally type in text and it'll just automatically add it. If you don't want that new column to the right, you could just Control Z and it'll just leave the value there. But in this case, we're just accepting it. And the other nifty thing is you can actually write formulas inside the table to refer to other tables or to the table that's currently there. So in this particular case, we're using this structured reference, which uses a prefix for the current row of the particular column. So in this case, the current row of component based on the cell position that we're currently editing. And when we add that in, it will give us the length of that particular field that's there. And then you have the ability to either populate that down manually by double clicking on, there's usually a little highlight in the lower right corner, or you can have Excel automatically expand it with a little context helper. Um, and the beauty of this is that once you've kind of done that, once you've included that formula down the column of the table, any changes to the column, or excuse me, any changes to the data, or if you add data to it, those formulas will automatically populate down and update based on the current row that that formula is being applied to. And again, we're just using a structured reference. So if we drag the entire table around or slide it, or if we change the column orders, say we wanted length to be in the first column instead of the third, um, these things will just automatically update as the grid. It's a very dynamic process and it works great. Um, Talking about these special references a little bit more, there are, just to kind of explain them, that ampersand is really kind of an indication for the current row. So if I put a formula outside of the table a few columns over in Excel and referred to the table and put the ampersand in for the component at that particular column, it's basically like just doing a cell reference, like you would normally do, except it's sensitive to the table at that point. So it is easy to do. Column Those column tags that are there basically are just saying the entire columns of data. The entire table is obviously with a hash all. Hash data would just give you the data region of the table. Hash headers would just give you the headers. So if you're looking for the index of a particular column, you could do that just by referencing the header. And then also the other slick thing is the totals row. So within Excel, you have this totals row, but you have to enable it. You just can't refer to it if it doesn't exist, even though they present it if it's not displayed, which is kind of weird. But the totals row can be enabled by going back up to the table design and saying, show me the totals row. Now, the neat thing about the totals row is that it's not just the total of the last column, which is basically the default that it tries to assume if it's numeric, but it also, each of these columns has, or each of these total rows for each column has this little context menu that can kind of pop up if you click in it. It's like a little validation cell that has additional aggregate functions. So if you wanted to get the count of things, or the count of number of occurrences, max or min values, or sum, you could actually go determine what are the particular values. This particular case, it's sum by default. And that's just extremely helpful. I mean, it's just nice to have that information at your fingertips, and you could set it there versus writing in a formula, but you could still refer to it also. So in these two examples that you see off to the right here, we have one that is referring to the table. It's looking at the totals reference and the length column. And that's enough to get the 128 to that particular cell if you were to do it. If you wanted to use a normal Excel formula to basically get the sum of the length column, you could do that also. But the structured reference is probably more stable versus the one below, because if the data changes in some weird way, uh, the structured reference is typically a, a a better result because you can allow the table to kind of auto compute the summaries in the end. So let's take a look at what tables look like in our Excel example here. Switch over to screen. So taking a look at tables, one of the things I want to show right off the bat here is I'm going to switch the formulas on this. Now, I've used formulas within this to kind of replicate what we were doing in the named ranges, and that works okay. If we show kind of our precedents and our descendants for here, you can kind of see it's still doing the same basic formulation, uh, but it's fundamentally cleaner. So the results are a little bit cleaner. We're using aggregate functions to kind of summarize the data, but it's at least easier to look at, and you could see that we're not doing cell-based references, um, you know, within a range and all that kind of stuff. It's just a little bit cleaner, but still these are complicated. These are still too complicated in my view for what we want to do, because this is pretty basic stuff. We're just trying to get a summary of the data that's here. So let's go take a look at how to do this with Power Query. Okay, switch back over. So within Power Query, These are really, really powerful. And again, like I said, once you kind of get your head around it and you figure out how to work with it, you're just not going to want to go back. They're just so much easier. So we're going to go kind of walk through this BOM cost estimation example, but we're going to do it in a little bit slicker way. So Power Query fundamentally requires tables as kind of inputs. And what I'm showing here is that we've kind of pre-selected a range. We've said, I'm going to go up to the data tab, which is how you access Power Query. And it's under the get and transform data section. It's not really called Power Query, but this is kind of how they refer to it. And if you go and you say, I want to get from a table or range, it's going to force you to create a table anyway, which is going to result in this Power Query editor. And you'll notice that the query name is the default name for the table it created, which is in this case table 5, which can be rather confusing. So this is why we recommend go create the table first, then go name the table, and then read in the table into Power Query, from table range, and then your table name makes more sense as to what it is. And you could of course change this. If we go another step further here, just kind of talking about what Power Query is and how it works. This is an interface that's built into Excel. It's a capability that's already there. We just kind of showed how to get to it. And this is like all this new functionality that opens up in a separate window. So you could do really cool stuff. Like for example, you can go modify column data and transform it. You can basically what Power Query does is it records steps of how you want to transform your data and load it and merge it. And those steps will accumulate as you move forward. And then you have all these options at the top for adding data, transforming the data, like if you wanted to transpose it or modify it in some way or perform math operations on it or do your own custom functions with it. You could do all this, and it's all at the query level versus the Excel level. So there's a lot of stuff that you would normally want to do that's just like right here. And it's just a question of what are the steps I want to do to transform it. So I'll give you an example. So this table of bill of materials stuff, when we read it into Power Query, we're going to basically define the steps that we want to occur to transform the data into the result that's currently being shown in Power Query. And that's the data, that's going to be the result of this transform. So you can see we took just 2 columns of information and then we transformed it, cleaned it up, and grouped it and summarized it, basically kind of getting all the summaries of the items that are in here into a new table view. But we got to get this back to Excel somehow. So the way you do that is there's really 2 options. If you just do a close and load, meaning close Power Query and load the data, the default is it's going to kind of annoyingly create a new worksheet, not a new workbook, but a new worksheet in your current workbook and load that data there. Once that's there, okay, great, it's there, but that may not be the only purpose I'm going to use for that. If all you're interested in is just getting that report of information, great, do that. Just accept the defaults and rock on. However, most of the time, especially when you're working with multiple tables of data or multiple sources of data, you really don't want to just load data to the worksheet every time, especially if you have a large data set. You just kind of want to create a connection to it. And that connection will still be in Excel. It's just not going to display and render all the data and worry about it as much. It's going to keep things a lot faster if you do it this way. So when you do that, you get this queries and connections, or so let's say you did this load of data and you're like, okay, I created my connection and everything like that. How do I find it again? Well, to find it, you basically go up to the data tab. There's a button there called queries and connections. And if you click that, it's going to expand out this little side tab that shows this is a query that's been defined. We can see that it's a connection only to some data. And if we double click on it, we can then get back to, go through what's the source of it, what is the transform doing, what's being loaded, what's being transformed, what's being formatted, and all that stuff. But we don't see that result on the workbook. We just see connection is there. Load that data in, you can actually right click on the query, assuming you created a connection, right click on that query and say load to, and then you can identify where you want it to go. So if you want to go to a pivot table, or you want to go to a pivot chart, or if you want it to load it to an Excel spreadsheet on an existing sheet that already has a table like this one, or its own sheet on a different one, you could do that. But when you do this, it will actually load that data in, and it will create a new table with a new table name for that too. And it's typically the query name by default, but you can change that. So just in these few steps, we've been able to take the data that's there, load it, transform it, and come up with a brand new report without writing a single Excel formula to get to this point. Now, the beauty about tables, as we talked about before, is if you add new items, it's going to automatically extend the table and so on and so forth. And then, but you'll notice that that query to the other side of there hasn't done anything with that yet. The reason for it is you have to refresh the data, or refresh the connect, or refresh the data that's been processed. So you could do that by either right-clicking on the table itself and saying refresh just this table, or the easy thing, which most people do, is just go up to data and hit refresh all. And when that's finished, you get your new item and your new counts. And again, we didn't have to write a single formula for any of this stuff. So not one formula required to basically take that reference information that is being updated or can change, run it through those processes in Power Query, and just write the results back to Excel. All that was just, I mean, it doesn't take very long to do, and when it's finished, it's finished. It's just a setup workflow, and it will just transform data every time according to whatever the data is that's there. So that's pretty cool, but what else can we do with this this piece of magic? So I want to show you real quick that even though we have a query connection set up for this BOM data that's in here, what if we wanted to compare that to the item costs that are coming from a different file on a different system? Well, I have it's actually pretty easy to do. You just go up to the data tab, say get data, and you got all these options. So this can come from another workbook, come from a CSV file, come from different formats of text files like XML or JSON, or you can connect it to a database directly. So if you have access to your MRP database where there's a standard report being written, or if you have a network drive where a CSV file is being written out every 24 hours for what your item costs and fastener purchases are, you can actually just kind of connect Excel to that. And if you have a network mount, or if you're on a network and you have open connections to the databases, you can then share this work you're doing. You can share this Excel workbook with anybody in the company, and if they open it and they have the credentials to get to the same information, they can just open the Excel book, hit refresh all, and it will just do whatever computing they need to do. It's pretty amazing when it comes to this. So in this case, we've said we're going to go get data from a file. It's going to be a CSV file in this case, and when you select that, it's going to say, okay, what do you want to do with this data? Do you want to transform it, like clean it up or modify it in any way for use? Or do you just want to load it? In this particular case, we're going to just load as a connection, which we talked about earlier. So when we load as a connection, you'll see that in my queries and connections, I have a query that's connected to my BOM data that's there, but I also have another connection to that external file that doesn't show up anywhere in the Excel workbook, but it's there, okay? So the beauty about this is that you can then take those two connections and play with them. So in this case, we're going to merge the data. So to do that, you just simply go up to the data, get data, combine queries. And in this case, we're going to merge the data to say, I want the data from my BOM table and the data from my cost table. Even though they have different columns, they have different data, I'm going to select the two columns that are important. And each of those rows that is in there, I want to match only those values and then merge that data together. And when you do this, it will actually bring up Power Query and show you your source data plus the data you're joining to. And it's indicating, well, there's a table of information there that has been merged. What do you want to get about it? You can just say, well, I can expand that out and say, really, I don't want to repeat the item name because it's already merged on that. And the component and item name are the same according to this criteria. I just want to include the unit cost. And when you include the unit cost, boom, we've got ourselves a brand new column that is actually the result of the two queries coming together. Now, typically we would rename this column to something that's, we don't need it to be item cost dot unit cost. That's useful, but it's not necessarily what we want to see in a final report. So we rename that, which I've done in the previous, in between these steps. And now we're just going to add in a new column to kind of give us, well, okay, what's the extended cost of each item that's in there based on quantity in that bill of materials. So adding a custom column is literally just adding a custom column. It gives you the name of columns that are there, and it's just a simple equation. You could just double click on the available columns in that interface and add them in, multiply them, subtract them, divide them, whatever funky math you want in there. You can even put if statements into this type of thing if you want to. The syntax is a little bit different than normal Excel, but it's approachable, and it'll tell you whether the formulas are good at the bottom before you commit them. The result of that would be to automatically have a new column here called extended cost, which we've just created. And then we're changing the name of this query to be cost summary so that we have something that's more descriptive about what this query is generating as a result. When we finally load that data back into Excel, you could see that we have our two queries above, we have our cost summary below, and as a result, we've just done a little bit of formatting on the columns within the result table to put like dollars, format for currency, things like that. But this didn't really require any effort to get there, and we got everything we needed for here's my list of components, and then boom, here's our cost summary of what those are based on the item costs, and we didn't even have to view the item cost data at all. It's completely going to dynamically update every time you load and refresh this data. So if your item costs are changing every day, and there's a file out there that you can reference every time you load this bill of materials up, boom, you just hit the refresh button. It'll show you what the current cost of that is based on the data in another system if you need to. So understanding the relationships between queries is actually pretty easy. Basically, what you do is if you see a bunch of queries in your query pane, like over here above this wow, if you see a bunch of queries over there and you're not really sure how they relate, you can just open up Power Query and go to the View Query Dependencies, and it will show you a nice little graphic that says, okay, current workbook has got this external files feeding this particular item, and the two of them are coming together to get that cost summary. And then from there on, it's just navigating and using things. So let's talk about Power Query and how it's kind of used within Excel. I'll just give you a quick example, then I want to show you something else. We're running a little bit short on time. So let's go to share this. Okay, so now Power Query, in this particular example, this is the same data that we started with, and I'm just going to quickly walk you through what the transformation is to get to this. This is another query that I wrote with Power Query also that is computing the items that I don't have cost for. So I've got, these are the items that I have cost for, and these are the items that are in this list that I don't have cost for. So if I added in a new, let's say test part, and came up to my data and said refresh all, boom, I see that I don't have an item in my cost data called test part at all. And it's just very easy to do that. So you can see here we've got our first query here takes the source data and cleans it up. This is our item cost reference to an external file. And then we have our sum costs that are here. And then we have another query that is doing the difference between the item costs and the BOM to try to find out what isn't in there and reporting that as a separate query. So to give you a bit of a live example, let me get rid of this row here because I don't want it to distract us too much. So if I come in and I want to create a brand new query, I'm just going to do it from table range, and I'm going to give it a different name. Let's call this live. So this is basically just a pointing up a reference to that original source data. It's showing me a preview of what's here. Now, if I came in and I said, well, okay, let's just I want to transform this data to kind of group it by, say, let's make this quantity is going to be our new column. It's going to be a count of rows. Now, all that's fantastic. But if we sort this, you'll notice that I've got some duplicate rows here for the same items. And if we look a little bit deeper, we could see, well, there's some of these have spaces in them. Some of them have different name. Some of them capitals and not. It's kind of screwing up things. So what we could do is we can actually come back and clean that up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select both columns and say, let's just transform this all to uppercase. That'll clean up any letter differences and so on and so forth. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to come in here and replace values. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take all the spaces out. And the next thing I want to do is let's also do, let's say a find and replace. Let's say if it has BLT, we really want that to be bolt, and that'll fix some of those issues. And oh, let's transform this data again, or let's maybe put back in. If it has a comma, I really want a comma and a space to kind of be there. And then let's just kind of make it more human readable. So let's capitalize each word. So just that quickly, we've been able to make these changes to this data. And again, this is the transformation. These are the steps that are going to execute every time this runs. So if we summarize this again and say, well, okay, let's try a group by now. This is going to be quantity. You'll notice that our list is a little bit shorter, which it should be. And we've now got clean data, a more accurate representation of what's going on here for the total on the components and everything. Once we have this here, if we just say close, it's going to load it to Excel, the worksheet as we described before. So that's the kind of the default behavior. You can only have one table per worksheet that is referenced off of this stuff. If we wanted just as a quick example, let's say that I wanted to create a merge of the data. Let's do our own little cost analysis. So I'm going to take that query table that I've created and let's take it in with our item cost data. And it's literally just a matter of selecting the columns and determining what amount of data we want between them. Once we have this, it's going to open up Power Query. We're going to expand this out, get our unit cost, and then we can also just add in a custom column. Say I want quantity times, this particular case is I'm leaving the original name that's there. You can also rename this afterwards. And say this is our new total. And in this particular case, I'm going to do a close and load to. Now I could do a connection, but in this case, I'm going to pop this right here just so we can kind of see the data that we're producing. And we can add the total rows in. It looks like we've got one more item in here than expected. So there's probably a data cleanup issue. Step I forgot to pursue or apply. But you get the oh no, sorry, we didn't. Yeah, no, that's correct. So we've got all the data in here that is from here, but it's being summarized. You can see the total's the same. There just might be oh, BLT. Okay, so let's go fix that real quick. So you can see BLT as a value that I needed to kind of replace. So let's actually go. Let's go and do transfer. Let's do a find replace values. Yeah, we're going to insert a step. Say BLT is also bolt. Whoops. Get down to the bottom here. Looks like that might be better. Close this. Now watch this. When we close this, this table should update. Okay, so now we've got everything kind of cleaned up. We've got our items corrected and everything. Formatting this stuff is really just a matter of kind of selecting these two columns, and you can just use your standard Excel formatting. And if you don't like the style of the table, you can actually come back to the design and say, well, I really like it to be presented this way instead. So pretty cool stuff. Stuart, are you still there?
I am sorry, I was just on mute.
Okay. You want to take an extra, just quick 5 or 10 minutes to talk about bill of materials exports with Creo real quick?
Yeah, I think so. Go for it.
All right, so let's talk about Creo bills of materials for a second. So I'm going to switch over to my screen. Sorry. Screen. Okay. So if you've ever done bills of materials with Creo, it's a bit of a challenge, and there are a couple a couple of reasons why. But as I think we've seen here, that if you can get the data into Excel, Power Query is like the most powerful tool ever for cleaning up some of the stuff and making use of it. However, getting the data out in a format that is acceptable is not always the easiest thing to do. There are a couple of options within Creo for exporting bills of materials, but they're a little bit tricky, and you've got to be conscious about what they do or what those options are and how they work. So if we take a look at, one of the first go-tos that everybody runs to is the BOM exports. Now, by default, I think it goes to the browser, the inside browser or the internal browser within Creo, and gives you kind of a breakdown in HTML. And we've tried to save that off and look at it. It's pretty painful, but you can say write to a text file. And if you write to a text file, it gives you basically the same report that you would get in a web browser. However, you can use these kind of BOM format files, which are a little bit cryptic. They've been around for a long time. They do require a bit of testing to kind of get kind of where you want. But once you use a BFT file, you can actually kind of get the bill of materials to kind of kick out. However, there are two levels of breakdown that are occurring there. You got a summary BOM option, and you also have a breakdown option. And there's problems with each of them. The summary BOM tends to exclude content that you may want, and the breakdown sometimes includes too much information that you don't need. So that's just one factor. And you could actually take this into Power Query and read it as text file and start to kind of work with it if you want to, but it's not going to be the most pleasant journey. Another option is also, well, what if you want a little bit of structure to come out of this? Like, what are the levels at for each of these items and so on and so forth? Well, you can get that from the model information on an assembly, but that file that gets generated includes a lot of extra information that you don't really need. So that's a parsing issue and a cleanup issue there. Again, it's possible, but it's in Power Query can probably help with that too. But it's a bit of an effort to kind of get there. The third most popular option is to just kind of go into the assumption that the bill of materials is actually on the drawing. And PTC does have this nice capability for doing a save as CSV from a table. The downside of this, and it works really well. I mean, of all the methods we've shown so far with regards to exporting bills of material, it's pretty clean. The problem is that if you have pagination issues with your tables, like if you have a table that wraps or goes to another, paginate it to another table on the same page or across multiple pages, each export, it only exports at the selected table, at least in the testing we've done. They might have changed it since we did this test with Creo 4, but fundamentally that's a bit of a struggle too. So the way that we do things with NitroBomb is actually everything that you've learned today or that we've talked about today with tables and Power Query is kind of built into the latest versions of NitroBomb. So when we do an export of the bill of materials from Creo, we're actually writing it to Excel tables by default. And then we're also creating those Excel Power Query connections for you so that you can easily fold in enterprise data or comparison data from other sources. Let's say you had a previous version of a bill of materials you're trying to compare with, or another design you're trying to compare with. That information is already in the right format within Excel through NitroBomb to be able to get to those results very quickly. The beauty about that is that anytime you update or do a next export, those calculations are going to be automatically updated for you. And then, of course, with NitroBomb, you can also do, the imports also. So I'm going to give you just a quick example of how to do that. Switch back over to environment here. So I have Creo open, and this same little example we kind of playing with. And I'm just going to take all of the defaults that I have here, and it's going to take an Excel file that's empty and populate it with the data that's currently in the Creo session. So it's going to fire up Excel. You can see it's an empty file, and it's starting to write all this data out. Now, it writes out in several different formats, and we're not going to cover everything today. We've got a whole nother series of videos online for that, but every one of these, as you can see, has come out in an Excel table format. You can actually change the formatting of these if you don't like it, and NitroBomb will remember this for the next export for each of these reports. So we've got all this data already kind of summarized and accurately calculated. And if you go up to the data tab here, you'll notice that, oh, there's my queries connections to each of those things that are already there. So if we wanted to, let's just say for giggles, just to show how quick this is, let's go add in that data that we have for items costs, and we'll actually have this derive the cost of this on the fly, then maybe demonstrate a change or two as we go along. So I'm going to load this as a query connection to that external file. And one of the things that you have to be aware of with these tables is we do export them as text data for all these cells. So this is also where Power Query comes in pretty handy. So if we come to our total components reference that's here, tell me if, oh, it's a second. So even though we have these connections that are kind of here, I think it's trying to connect out to the internet to look for something. But let's give it a second. This total components query that's here, we can actually modify this. So you can see here that this is currently a text column. We want to transform this to a whole number because it is going to be a whole number. And you can see that it's just making that change. Now, the beauty of this is that once we've got this, we've got these two queries in here, I'm going to do a combined query between the total components, which is got all that stuff, and our item costs. We're going to merge on these two columns and only grab the stuff that we have pricing for. Just that quickly, starting to get this table organized. Now, for our final table, you can actually come in and say, well, okay, this is I'm going to click the columns that I want to keep and ignore everything else. So now I'm starting to kind of format my report a little bit and say unit cost, oops, unit cost. And let's add in our kind of custom column for computing the extended cost. Just hit the quantity times the unit cost. And total cost. And I'm just going to allow this to create a worksheet and generate that report for me. So it's going to create a new worksheet with this here. We'll enable our total row. Then we'll just select these columns here. Put a little bit of formatting on them just so that we have something nice. Let's also just bump this up in size so it's easier to see. Oops, these right numbers. Okay, so now the question comes down to, well, okay, we've got this workflow set up for computing the cost. What happens if the design changes? So I'm just going to go in and add in a few components just randomly. So add in a couple of those. Come down and add in these. Maybe one other. So let's see what we have. So we have a couple of new plates, a couple of other components. So with NitroBomb, all you have to do is come back and say, just re-export the reports, please. And it will go and update each of those reports. And it will automatically do, because we have a setting for this, to automatically refresh the queries. So you might have saw this do a little cycle. And if we come back to our result here, boom, we've got our assembly costs automatically being computed based on that external file, as well as the data, the latest data that's been exported from Creo. Okay, with that, any questions or any, Stuart, do we have any questions that we need to address?
Nothing in the chat session. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them out, or you could unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. I think that means either you did a great job of explaining, or maybe people are feeling a little overwhelmed.
Hopefully not overwhelmed. It's really not that hard. I think that Excel is very approachable. We try to make it easier to understand, like what the process is. But until you go through step by step to kind of do it a couple times, it's going to feel a little bit foreign. But hopefully, this video that we've done encourages people to kind of step through, pause, to mimic some of the steps and get the results on their own.
Well, thank you very much. I think it shows a lot of the power of Excel, and I know often the more you know about Excel, the more you realize how little you know about Excel. So it's certainly enlightening.
Definitely, yeah, we definitely hit the not the upper echelons of its capabilities, but a step certainly above what most people use. And I think it's just an awesome automation tool, especially with when combined with our tech, of course, too. So with that, I'll turn this back to you for closure, and then we can just kind of go from there.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. Yeah, at this point, mostly just want to say thank you for the presentation. I think it's easy to see how this could be really powerful. You can tie Excel to Creo, and it's kind of the sky's the limit at that point. So certainly some of the automation tools you guys have are very powerful.
Thank you. Thanks for having the opportunity to come together and present this today.
Well, if anyone does have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help and happy to do so.
All right. Thanks a lot, Stuart.
Thanks, Dave. Take care, everyone.